Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Rome. My name is Matias Niemelä. I'm here to open the conference for NGRome and to deliver the opening keynote. The link right there is to the slides. I'll be sure to have these tweeted out right after the keynote is over. So as Leonardo said, I've been involved with Angular for quite some time. I believe in the summer of 2012, that's when I first started writing Angular applications. And then a few months later, I started contributing and making blog posts and then getting involved with the team. Right now, I work as a software engineer at Google on the Angular team in San Francisco, California. And I was born in Finland. I spent most of my life in Canada, and I've been in the United States now for almost 5 years. So this journey of building Angular, helping be a part of the project and the framework, living in California, and getting to know all kinds of cool things about the open source community has been a lot of fun. I've met a lot of cool people. I've attended some cool conferences, been to some cool places. But the main thing is that I've got to be a part of such a really cool project such as Angular. And there's a lot of cool insights and a lot of techniques and really amazing software things that I've learned that I want to share with you throughout the keynote. And that's why we're all here today. Of course, we're here to learn about Angular and to attend some of the sessions and communicate with some Angular experts here at the conference. NGRome has over 13 sessions, and we have a speaker panel at the end of the day. And we have close to 350 attendees here. So welcome to the conference. Right now, Angular, the framework, has 2 versions. We have a stable release, and we have the next release. Right now, we are at 8.2.9. And in a few weeks' time, we'll have the 9.0 release, which will become stable, and then we'll head towards Angular 10. Every time there's a new release, new features, whether it be a small weekly release or a major release that's released every half a year, all of our documentation, our code examples, our getting started tutorials will all update on the website automatically. A few weeks ago, we had the main European conference for Angular, Angular Connect, which took place in London. We had various people from the Angular team show some of the new features with the new versions of Angular and talk about Angular in the framework in very deep subjects. We have things about the runtime and the compiler, as well as other tools and techniques that you can use with Angular. So when you leave the conference today, have a watch with some of the videos that we have from the Angular Connect YouTube channel, and it'll give you an idea of how everything works. So with Angular itself globally, we have each year we have more and more events taking place. This conference is a great example. There are new events popping up all over the place. We also have NG Girls, which is an amazing organization which teaches women and young girls how to code with Angular, as well how to program websites. This organization has grown and grown over the years, and they have many events that happened in 2019, and a few more that will take place before the end of the year. Visit their website to learn more. And, of course, NGRome. It's funny with this conference because, as Leonardo said, we're good friends, and we're such good friends that he told me, he's like, oh, I have a new conference I'm putting together. I'm like, cool, can I see the website? And then I see my face on the website. And it was the keynote speaker. And I never agreed to it, but here I am. But that's what good friends are for, right? Anyways, what are we going to discuss today? Well, in this 7-year period that I've been building Angular websites, I want to share some of the insights that I've learned, what it takes to make a really good library and a framework. Then I want to hop into where Angular is today, all the features that we landed with Angular 8, and what the community looks like with some plugins such as NGRX and RxJS. Finally, I want to take a look at Angular 9 and Ivy and show you where Angular is going to be going in a few weeks' time. If you stick around until the end of the day, we have a closing keynote as well with 2 really important figureheads in the software development community, John Papa and Dan Whalen. Later today at 5, they will talk about Angular architectural concepts. So back when I first learned Angular, I was a freelance developer. I was living in Canada at the time. And I was building full-stack websites, with Rails and PHP and Node. And on the front end, I was doing a lot of stuff with jQuery and MooTools. And back then, it was right at the turn of all these new JavaScript libraries coming out that would take control of the whole page, single-page applications. And I had to make a choice between using one of these or sticking to a smaller library. And ultimately, I chose AngularJS because it was powered by Google, it was well-tested, it was well-known, and it enabled me to build these really complex websites that I wanted to. Now, back in 2012, we didn't have Angular 2 or Angular 9. What we instead had was AngularJS, which was more of a library than a framework. Back then, we didn't have build systems, we didn't have TypeScript, we didn't have these complex dependency management systems. All we had was an index.html page that will connect everything together. And this is how libraries are. Libraries come in all shapes and forms. I'm sure if you look at someone's laptop beside you, you'll see all kinds of stickers with all kinds of tools and libraries and frameworks, platforms that are available in the open source community. And this is the beautiful thing about open source development, is that we have access to all this software. But you might be wondering, it's 2019, and why are frameworks still a thing? I mean, if 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I was using a framework to build a tiny website, what's changed? Haven't browsers caught up? Haven't the web technologies such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript improved to take on some of the more complex challenges that we need? Why should we be using a framework to this day? And the answer is other technologies. It's not so much about what you're trying to do with a specific technology. Sometimes it's about merging other technologies together. And this is why you need to use a framework, or a platform, or a library, or a tool. So to give an example, anyone here who uses the Angular CLI, that tool, which is designed to basically serve your Angular application or package it together, internally it's making use of tons of other technologies, such as Rollup and TypeScript. And from your perspective as a user, you don't know. In fact, you don't really care what's going on behind the scenes. All you care about is that it's handling the code for you and producing the output that you want. So with that being said, libraries and frameworks and platforms are always going to be important. And Angular is essentially a collection of robust APIs. So it's a platform or a framework that includes multiple technologies together. The beautiful thing with this is that every time there's a new version of Angular, all of these technologies will upgrade frictionlessly. So let's say you upgrade to Angular 9 in a few weeks. You don't have to worry about all the other technologies behind it. It will update automatically. These APIs will remain consistent. We know that things will remain stable, so we're not going to have any breaking changes between versions. Only when there's a new major version release, we'll deprecate some features and we'll introduce new features. And of course, all of this is well tested, and it's a part of Google. We have hundreds of applications at Google that use Angular, and as soon as we make changes, we know exactly what breaks and what doesn't work. When it comes to Angular and what it can offer you, I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar. We have all kinds of technologies below it, such as tools that can do animations and forms and routing, server-side rendering, and as well as the CLI. And this list continues to be strong and stable, and we'll be adding more features in the future. If you're interested to learn about how to mix Angular with other technologies, have a look at Maurizio's talk later today where he'll talk about TensorFlow. So as I mentioned, Google makes use of Angular heavily. We have over 1,500 applications in Google, and they're all connected into one version of Angular. So if I were to go to work Monday in a week and start changing some of the code and saving it, I would immediately know which applications break and which ones don't work. And this is incredibly powerful for Angular, because when Angular is delivered to the users, we know exactly what works and what doesn't. So in this 7 years that I've been building stuff with Angular, what are some lessons that I've learned? Well, really, building the framework has just been a matter of APIs. Building a certain tool and technology, say whether it be animations or forms or the router, that's an API that you expose to the user. And what I've learned about this is there's many ways to build things. The framework can be doing whatever it can to make things fast and optimal, but the API needs to remain stable and be properly designed, because at the end of the day, the API is the most important thing. Take, for example, a video game controller. If anyone here has been played Super Nintendo recently, you'll notice the controller has been, for the past 20 years, probably more than 20 years, it's been incredibly reliable and consistent. You're used to the API here. You have buttons that you press, start and select, directional pad, and these signals are sent to the video game receiver. So if you think about Angular, if you have a directive or a component that has inputs, and that data is passed in, those are the inputs just as the same as a controller has inputs. From your point of view, and from any person's point of view who's using this controller, they don't care what's happening behind the scenes. They don't care about the algorithms and the signals and the circuitry that sends the data over into the video game console. All they care about is that the data is interpreted and processed in the correct way. Now, what is the correct way? As long as the video game console or a framework or a tool or a library handles the data correctly, then that's all that matters, right? But there's many ways to do this. How do we handle error handling? How does this code look like? The most important thing of this, of course, is what are the hidden features? Let's say that I pushed 5 buttons at the same time. Will the game console switch off? That is unideal, but that might be a hidden feature. So it's really important to think about these things when building libraries and frameworks. Of course, I could take the controller apart. I could look at the circuitry. I could figure out what the buttons are and exactly what they do. I could also go into the Angular source code and figure out how it all works behind the scenes. But users are not going to do this. All that users care about is that the API works as expected. And that being said, the API is the most important thing. And this is what I've learned with working with Angular for a long time. You really need to think clearly about what you design when building a framework and make sure that it can be maintained and stable across time. And this is important for libraries, for frameworks, and of course for Angular. Let's do one more example here. ng-style and ng-class. These have been a part of Angular 2 since it was first released. What these do is they take in CSS classes and CSS styles and apply them to the element correctly. At the end of the day, though, who cares how these are implemented? They could be a directive, they could be a part of the framework, they could have something to do with the compiler. All that you care about is that the data is processed and applied effectively, just like a video game controller. And this just goes to show that the API is the most important thing. The API is king. If you're interested to learn about how to architect Angular applications with Angular libraries, have a look at Fabian's talk, which is directly after my talk today. OK, so that kind of gives you an idea of the philosophy we have for building Angular applications at Google. What about Angular version 8? So with Angular version 8, we have a variety of new features. We have things like differential loading, which allows you to load in a different kind of bundle for a newer browser, easier deployments, the router. The CLI upgrades that we have in place allow you to upgrade your application much easier. And we have nice little things for ECMAScript 6, such as dynamic imports. Finally, the custom builders that we have in the CLI also enable you to have more control over the build process of an Angular application. So if I were to go into Angular 8 and look at all the things that we have, I could go for each of these sub parts of the framework. We could look into animations, we can look into protractor, we can look into progressive web applications. We don't have time to go through all of these things, so let's talk about a couple features. So the CLI. If you have an Angular application that you build, chances are you're using the Angular CLI to get started. And what the CLI is, it's the command line interface that will connect your Angular application to the terminal, launch a server, run all the build tools, and so on. We've done some upgrades with this. The first thing we've done is we've created a brand new index.html page when you create a Hello World application. So as soon as you do ng new application, you'll see this page. Now, this is very helpful for beginners and people who are new to Angular, because this will tell you how to get started by making components and what to learn next. If you have an older version of Angular and you want to upgrade to, say, version 8 or in a few weeks, version 9, we have these really helpful commands now where you can just run ng-update and you can tell which package to update in your application. So not only will the dependencies and the NPM code be updated, Angular will also go into your framework or into your application and figure out what packages to update in what way. Finally, once you've upgraded all your packages, it's just a matter of running ng-serve. So we've had success in the past with other customers who are heavy users of Angular. What we found is that with each release of Angular, the upgrade process has been easier and easier. As you can see, the jump from Angular 6 to 7 was just 1 day compared to what it was before. And with Angular version 8 and version 9, it's getting easier and easier to upgrade your application. If you are interested to see what it takes to upgrade to Angular 8 and eventually Angular 9, please visit update.angular.io and also take a look at the Angular documentation. The next feature I wanted to talk about is differential loading. So if anyone's been building websites for a long time, you'll know that certain browsers enable certain new features, while other browsers don't. Now, sometimes you'd like to make use of these features without having to support older browsers, and sometimes not. And this is where things get tricky when building web applications. So what Angular's done is that it's built in a system called differential loading, where it's able to split your application bundle into 2 entry points, one for older browsers and one for newer browsers. Now, you don't need to write this code in your application. As soon as you enable this feature in Angular, Angular will automatically generate this code into your index.html file. All that you need to do is tell what target you would like to have your application be compiled for. ES 2015, it includes all the new JavaScript features from 2015 and onwards. And what this will do is it will create a bundle for the older browsers and a bundle for the newer browsers that support ES 2015. So NGRX, this isn't tied to the Angular version 8 release, but it continues to be expanded and improved on. And this right here is very popular in the Angular community. In fact, it's so popular that we have a couple talks to talk about this. Bonnie and Samantha will be talking about NGRX and GraphQL, while Mike will be talking about NGRX components and how to make those work across an application. Now, NGRX makes use of RxJS behind the scenes, and this is an incredibly important library in the front-end world. And Juan will be talking about how RxJS works and how to use it with JavaScript. So please stay tuned for this talk, which is happening later today at 3:45. So what about version 9? I've talked about version 8. I've talked about some of the new features. Version 9 is where a lot of the activity is headed to right now in Angular. So if anyone here has heard of Angular Ivy before, Angular Ivy is a new big thing that's going to arrive in the framework very, very soon. In fact, with the version 9 release, it's going to be enabled by default. So what exactly is Ivy? From my point of view, as someone who works in the framework, it's a refactoring of the whole framework. We've taken a look at everything that we've had to and rebuilt it so that it can be used for tomorrow in a much more effective way. Now, for people using Angular, what it will do is enable new features. It will make things more performant. There's a whole list of things that it does. But the most important thing is that it puts the framework in shape so it can be extended and developed further and further into the future. Here are some of the features that Angular Ivy enables us to have. I'll talk about a few of these things, such as the bundle size and the tooling and debugging. But there's a bunch of more other features that it does. So let's talk first about the size and bundle optimizations. So just as I had with the differential loading, that is basically generating a JavaScript file that's going to be used in your application. So it could be one file that includes the entire app. It could be split into multiple files. You can even have it so that it's separate chunks that are loaded when you visit a certain page in your application. But the point of this is that you have all of the code. You have the framework code, and then you have the application code delivered to the user. And we were thinking, how do we have less code delivered to the user? How do we make things faster? Because you might have a fast internet connection where you can download everything, but you might be on a mobile phone, or you might be in a different country that has a less performant internet connection. And it would be nice if an Angular application were to download itself very quickly and work as you expect it to. So there are things you can do with your application code. You can just have less components, less plugins, less features. But there's not that much that you were able to do with the framework. So we've done some JavaScript bundle size optimizations internally inside of the Angular project. Take, for example, a class in TypeScript. Here we have a class that has a first name, a last name, and age, and has a couple methods that mutate the data on the class. Now, this is TypeScript code. As you're developing something with a class in object-oriented programming, you're not very much wondering that it's a lot of code that's generated. So here, for example, once it's generated into ECMAScript 5 code, you can see how much code remains. We have function tokens, we have a prototype, and you'll notice that the properties on the class, the first name, the last name, the age, as well as the method names, don't get renamed. So uglify or Cursor is unable to go there and rename the properties so that they can be more efficiently compressed. So what we've done in Angular is, for this example, instead of using a class and method names, we've just used simple functions, and we used arrays as a storage mechanism, kind of like RAM, so that when we have something like this, which includes some TypeScript things such as interfaces and enums, when this runs through TypeScript, you can see that it gets compressed much smaller, because there's far less code that's left over once TypeScript has dealt with everything. And if you imagine that we've built the whole framework in this way, with Ivy, we've been able to reduce the bundle size of the framework by 30%. And with a number of other optimizations that we've done, we've been able to increase the performance of Angular and, of course, reduce the bundle size of the framework. Now, I won't go through all these things in the list, but the idea here is that we have a strict philosophy when developing Angular from the inside out so that things remain fast and performant. But reducing the code in the application doesn't get rid of the code that you don't need. If you were to load a Hello World application and make use of the router, but not have any routes in your page, why should you have the router in the application? Why should you use animations if you don't have any animations in the code? So what we've been trying to do with Angular, what we've been working towards, is this idea of tree shaking. So let's take a video component, for example. What's happening here? Well, we have a video tag and we have some sources. Now, the video tag is a part of HTML, but let's say, for example, that we recreate it using Angular. Now, we can see that we have a component, we have some inputs, we have the sources, right? There's nothing really crazy going on here. But if you wonder what it looks like when this is compressed and generated into Angular machine code, you can see that we have functions that create the elements and set up the attributes, as well as set up the sub-elements for the sources. Now, these are all function names with the example you showed before, so the compression is much better. But you can see here that these are only functions that are provided from the template. So when this is compressed, it will automatically generate the instructions. And the instructions that you don't use, in this case, things like styling and sanitization, internationalization, all of those are removed from the application that you don't need. And the way that we do this is that because they're all functions and they're not connected into the framework in any way, after you've built your application, Rollup will go through and delete all the code that you don't need to use in your application. And what this enables us to have is very small and portable web components for Angular applications. And if we use Angular elements on top of this, we can take each of these small and portable web applications and use them as reusable widgets in our application. So this is what Ivy enables us to do, and this is what the future of Angular will be. If you're interested to know more about Angular elements and even how to lazy load them in your application, have a look at Yuri's chat, which is later today. So let's talk about some of the new features that Ivy has. Because so far, Ivy has just been a refactor, and a huge performance optimization for the framework. But there are some new things that it enables us to do. So the styling is one of the big ones. Styling is really essential to an Angular application. You have things like CSS styles and classes that need to be added to an element in the correct way. What we've done is we've gotten rid of ngClass and ngStyle and just have class and style. But class and style now work alongside all the other style bindings in an application. So if we have a directive or if we have other bindings on the same element, Angular will be able to merge them all together. Now if here, for example, we have a directive that enables you to have a style binding with dynamic styles in an application. And what Angular will do is it will look at all these binding sources and merge them together. Let's take a look at an example of this quickly. So here we have a page that has a modal. And the modal itself has various style bindings. We have width and height, transform. We have a dynamic set of styles. And we also have a directive that sets styles. The modal component also has some default styles. So let's disable all of these styles right here. You can see that the styles from the modal are used by default. But now in Angular Ivy, we have a prioritization model that if you click on a certain binding, say the width, it will override the values in the component and the directives. But Angular will also do some sophisticated style merging, and it will figure out the difference in the styles very efficiently and effectively. And this is incredibly useful if you're building a component and you want other people to have overrides for your component. The styling will be predictable and consistent. And the algorithm that powers this is incredibly efficient. So that's one of the new features in Angular Ivy. Let's talk about the debugging tools that we have in Angular Ivy. If anyone here built things with AngularJS back in the day, you'll know that we had things like angular.element, where we can get a hold of any element on the page and figure out its scope. And this was useful in the application, but it was also very useful for debugging. In Angular Ivy, when you're developing your application in development mode, if you open up the console and type in ng, you'll see a list of helpful utilities that you can do to debug your application and troubleshoot certain things. So let's take a look at this example. Here we have the demo page that we had earlier. Now, this isn't much of an Angular application. In fact, there's only one binding here. But let's say that I click on an element. Here, I'm looking through the console. And let's go to the application root. So if I type in ng, you can see that I have all of these helpful utilities. And these utilities are immediately available when you serve your application in development mode. So now if I do ng.getComponent and $0, which is the element that I clicked in the console, you can see that I got the component and I have access to the component directly in the console. So if I change this, so let's say we say C equals this, and we say C.title, and we say welcome to NGRome, you can see that nothing updated on the page. All I did is I changed the component inside of TypeScript. But now if I do ng.markDirty and I give it the component, you can see that it updates directly in the page. So these debugging tools enable us to hop into an application that's running and be able to test things. And the nice thing is that if you use a certain feature in Angular, like a new library or a new plugin, they can also export some of these debug utilities. So here, for example, I'm going to click on the modal that I had. Oops. So here we have the modal in the page. And now if I do ng.getDebugNode, we get all this information about it. But with all the styles that I had in this component, this is a plugin that we have in Angular. I can just do styles. And now I get access to all the styles. And if I do .values, I can see exactly all the styles that have been applied to the element at a certain time. So imagine if you have an application that has a lot of debugging that needs to be done to troubleshoot things, you can build plugins that will export these things directly into your Angular application. Oops, sorry. So if you're wondering how to make use of Angular Ivy, it has been enabled since Angular version 8. You can hop into the tsconfig, add in the flag to enable Ivy, or you can build a new application from scratch with enable Ivy. But in a few weeks, once Angular 9 comes out, this will be enabled by default. And how far along are we? Well, so far we're at about 98% with all the tests working in Google with this new version of Angular, and we're getting closer and closer to that 100%. And it's only really a few weeks away until we have Angular version 9, and you can start testing Ivy out in the wild. So for the rest of the conference, there's a few talks that I didn't highlight in the slides. We have all kinds of cool topics that talk about Angular, but also talk about software development outside of Angular, as well as amazing things like progressive web apps and native applications. As for the rest of the conference, I hope that you'll enjoy your stay here today at Rome and NGRome. Please ask any of us presenting today for any helpful questions about Angular, and we'll be happy to help you improve your Angular careers. Thank you.